issue in question is, as you all know, academic freedom, and it's a term with multiple cultural and epistemological implications and connotations, and the topic has gained renewed interest in the last roughly maybe a decade, and that was first and foremost, of course, due to the increased political attacks against dissident scholars and institutions in various countries, and accordingly, the discourse has predominantly focused on a political and human rights-oriented framing of the term. Today I want to talk about the shortcomings or even dangers of this type of one-dimensional focus, and I'm going to do this partly in light of this fresh from the oven edited volume that I had the pleasure of co-editing with a political scientist colleague and a dear friend, Asli Vatansever. So in following, I will explain why a purely political understanding of academic freedom cannot help us anymore in the 21st century. And I will do this drawing on the practical examples that our contributors in that edited volume gave from the leading scientific countries that are theoretically supposed to enjoy a great deal of academic freedom. But I'm going to show you that it all depends on how you actually define academic freedom. And I will elaborate on what type of academic freedom concept that we have proposed in the book instead. But let's first take a look at the main traits of the prevalent academic freedom conception that dominates the current discourse. What does it entail? Well, first of all, it represents an understanding of freedom as the absence of overt oppression, censorship, or direct political intervention into research and teaching. This is what actually, and this has been the default definition, and whenever someone talks about academic freedom, this is basically what they have in mind, like the absence of political intervention into research and teaching, right? This is what we all automatically associate with academic freedom. Now, I see several problems with this definition. First of all, I have to say, on a logical level, I would say that this definition is based on a logical policy. It is based on a very shallow, ill-considered syllogistic logic that basically ascribes the existence of something to the absence of another thing. Right? It's like, you know, when there's oppression, there is no freedom. When there is no oppression, there is automatically freedom. Like, I mean, I don't see any difference between that proposition, that set of propositions, and, you know, a proposition like, human beings don't have tails, fruit flies don't have tails either, so human beings are fruit flies. You know, this is that kind of Aristotelian syllogistic logic. And as you can see, this is an argument based on a disconnected misjudgment. It draws on a false causality. It confuses necessity with sufficiency. The absence of overt political oppression is a necessity, is a prerequisite, it's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient to guarantee freedoms. And on a socioeconomic level, it gets even worse, because following from that false logic, it totally ignores multiple social factors that determine the boundaries of formal freedoms. And these socioeconomic factors include the market mechanisms, work cultures, entrenched hierarchies within the universities, hierarchies that shape academic hiring and advancement procedures, intersectional factors that create very different career chances for early and mid-career researchers, and structural inequalities. In short, actually, all of the circumstances that shape and limit researchers' actual capabilities of realizing those formal freedoms. Those formal freedoms may be there on paper, but the extent to which we can realize them in our own careers is determined by multiple factors. Now, the problem is, the political conception of academic freedom ignores these multiple factors, and this one-dimensional focus prevails in almost all of the key texts and sources on academic freedom that have been published so far. I mean, of course, the current radical authoritarianism has reinforced that type of focus, kind of dictated that sort of focus, because there's an emergency in various regions of the world. So we had to intervene via political means, and we had to emphasize the human rights abuses in order to also create a rhetoric and in order to, well, motivate the sponsors, right? You have to create funding for people who are fleeing their countries, and you have to create a rhetoric. This is a practical necessity. This has been a practical necessity. But even before then, that type of political focus was actually prevalent in classic works such as Conrad Russell's Academic Freedom from 1993, or Richard Hofstadter's Academic Freedom in the Age of College from 1996. And if you look at those works, you will see that both of them actually reduce freedom to the absence of state intervention. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the current academic freedom indexes that have been in circulation. One of them have been recently published by Kitzelbach and colleagues. Even those academic freedom indexes that are in circulation in the last years adhere to this negative conception of academic freedom as mere exemption from state oppression. This has been the basic criteria in defining the level of academic freedom in different parts of the globe. Now, this is understandable, because if you think about it, even the legal framework, the main legal framework regarding academic freedom is as it was defined by the declaration of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from 2020, was based on this negative conception of academic freedom. Like, this is the main legal framework that we have been operating within. And the most frequently deployed academic freedom index is, of course, drawn on that legal framework as their main source. Now, they narrow academic freedom down to, and this is the definition that they use in their work, they narrow it down to the protection of researchers from undue influence. From undue influence.
What would that mean?
It means an influence from an external actor that has nothing to do with the university context. This is what they have in mind. And basically, who can exert that sort of undue influence on a university is the state. Of course, not individual actors, but the state, right? Now, please note that freedom here is being defined as protection, first and foremost. When we say freedom, we actually mean protection from undue influence. And please note how patronizing this sounds. When you reduce freedom to protection, you actually subliminally signal that the body in question here that is supposed to exert that freedom needs to be first and foremost protected by someone else, right? These are all implications of that type of understanding. And there has been so far only one exception that complemented this political focus with the aspect of job security, and that was the American Association of University Professors. They have been acknowledging that political intervention is not the only threat against academic freedom, and they argue that corporatization of higher education in the 21st century is currently one of the main threats against academic freedoms. I mean, they know what they're talking about because the situation in the US has been terrible. We are going to talk about these developments in a bit, but to give you an idea, the number or the percentage of temporarily employed researchers and teaching staff has increased by over 200% since 1979 in the US. So it's understandable that it was the American Association of University Professors who drew attention to how the corporatization of higher education actually negatively influences academic freedom. But even they conceptualize academic freedom mainly as freedom from interference in teaching and research. Right? They emphasize the importance of job security, but their understanding of freedom is still based on the absence of interference into research and teaching, whether it may be interference by the market or by the state. So what you see in the academic freedom is, of course, nothing new. This understanding of freedom as mere absence of overt oppression has a long history and is present in many fields, from theories of justice to political philosophy. It stems from a specific conception of freedom which we call negative freedom. And there's a long line of intellectual tradition that stretches from Thomas Hobbes and John Locke to Friedrich Hayek. I don't know to what extent you're familiar with the basic theories of freedom and social order. For example, Hobbes emphasized the absence of external impediments in terms of freedom. Locke interpreted freedom as the liberty from the arbitrary will of another man. Friedrich Hayek, much later in the mid-20th century, developed his ideal theory of free markets with a similar understanding of freedom as formal protection from state interference into the market, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, this conception is based on formal guarantees, and it's pretty much detached from the social parameters of the applicability of those formal freedoms, right? They're talking about an ideal configuration where freedom exists as in a vacuum without any interference, and this is mainly legal protection of freedoms. Now, there are, of course, some thinkers who drew attention to the contradictions of such a one-dimensional approach to freedom, and this is actually, that was the meaning behind the title of our edited volume, Free as a Bird, because when Marx described the emerging proletariat as Vogelfrei, which means free as a bird in German, and we took it as our title because I'm completely in love with Marx. He was actually pointing to this problem. He looked at the situation of the former serfs who suddenly had to flock to cities and leave the rural areas, the land that had hitherto been their source of existence, and they had to become wage laborers. So in that development, the bourgeois historiography interpreted it as freedom, freedom from the fetters of the guilds and freedom from the feudal bondages, etc. Of course, this is true in one sense, but this is only one side of the story. And Marx actually saw in this liberty from being formally owned the contradiction of deprivation from possessing the means of production. And the former peasants were not freedom moved. They were not in feudal bondages anymore, but they were equally dependent on wage labor to survive. And Marx asked, what kind of freedom is that? Is that the ideal freedom that we are expecting from human society? Is that what we strive towards? Now, Marx was of course not alone in recognizing the contradictions and discrepancy between freedom as mere absence of oppression and freedom as a concrete capacity to act on your own interests. Before him, Hegel had also acknowledged the difference between formal and substantive freedom, and he had described laws as just a formal precondition of realizing freedoms. But the real systematic distinction was later drawn by Asli in his seminal work, Two Concepts of Liberty in 1969. And it was actually Asli who formulated the distinction between positive and negative freedom. So when we use these terms, this is actually, they have been framed as such by Asli. And according to this, negative liberties refer to freedom from coercion, whereas positive liberties correspond to the liberty to achieve valued outcomes. And most of the time, we only take the former as our understanding of freedom, and this is where problems occur. So, as you can see, negative freedom, which also shaped our understanding of academic freedom so far, represents a formal conception of academic freedom that does not pay attention to the practical conditions and to the extent to which individuals can make use of their academic freedoms. And the main shortcomings of this approach are actually twofold, and we have focused on this in our introduction in the book. First of all, this type of academic freedom, as Esther also gave a heads up in her introduction, it reflects the entrenched Eurocentrism of the epistemological and political paradigm we continue to operate with. It focuses only on political factors, such as state censorship and oppression and human rights abuses, and by doing that, it allows the academic freedom discourse to deal with only what's happening afar, in the periphery of the world economy, outside of the countries that are characterized by functioning parliamentarian democracies. And this outside, with these volatile regimes, happens to be the periphery or the semi-periphery of the world economy, which also happens to be the periphery of the global academic system. Now the thing is, in the so-called leading scientific countries of the global north, which are also part of the core of the world economy, there may be no overt political oppression yet, but there are multiple other mechanisms that restrict researchers' capabilities. Like, for example, if you look at the situation in the leading scientific countries at the moment with the highest gross domestic expenditure on research and development, you see that there has been a decrease in state funding gradually and steadily since the early 1980s. And consequently, there has been an increase in third-party funding in higher education. And it allowed market incentives to impose research agendas or even curricula. If you think about how many graduate programs or undergrad programs have been shut down due to, being non-profitable, you would get the idea how the market actually intervenes into research and teaching. Or, teaching is being extensively outsourced to adjunct lecturers. And academic labor market regulations keep casualizing academic work, and you end up with masses of temporarily employed precarious academics who become susceptible to workplace harassment, self-censorship, even sexual harassment, unpaid overwork. And most of them find themselves in situations where they are compelled to wrap their research ideas in marketable terms in order to get funding. You see, all of these issues, all of these factors, undermine academic freedoms of researchers to a considerable extent, despite the absence of overt oppression in leading scientific countries. But they remain invisible if you only focus on the politically conceived and one-dimensional negative academic freedom conception. Another problem with this approach is that it ignores systemic interdependencies which, as Sarah also mentioned in her introduction, because we have been talking about these issues actually since we met, and we both had a problem with that. And when I say systemic interdependencies, I mean the systemic interconnectedness of the core and the periphery of the world system. You know, this conception of academic freedom actually acts like what is happening in the peripheral countries has nothing to do with what is going on in the core, right? I mean, in some distant countries, terrible things are happening. Thank goodness we are here, right? This is the kind of, well, conservative thinking, I would say, that prevails around here. But the thing is, we are living in a capitalist world economy where different parts of the globe actually fulfill predetermined roles within the global capital accumulation. They are tied with one another through production and commodity chains. That means they serve different but interrelated functions within the global division of labor. There is a global division of labor which predetermines the methods of labor coercion in each functional part of the global economy. And yeah.
Would it be too random to point out the example maybe of the wall that's being built between Mexico and the US and another wall that is between Greece and Turkey?
The wall between Greece and Turkey? There's a border. There's no wall as far as
there is a border that you started building it in 2012.
A wall between Greece and Turkey? Do you know anything about it? I haven't heard of it. I'm from Turkey. Mera is from Turkey. We don't know anything about a border.
There is a.
Maybe they forgot to alarm me and Mera.
It's absurd. No, I was looking at it because I wanted to make a trip to Georgia, and the only way you can go through, like from Greece to Turkey, is passing by India.
The wall between Greece and Turkey?
Yes.
I mean, it's a border check.
It's a border.
It's a border check.
But there's
Turkey and Greece are
for the
Yes.
discussion, so maybe we can just, because it's taking the discussion towards maybe another direction. So
Yeah.
we can, it's a good question, but I would leave it for the discussion if you don't mind.
The political economy of borders is a different, of course related, but a different focus on which I cannot claim expertise. But we can talk about it. But there's no wall between Greece and Turkey. Not that I know. So anyway, so we were talking about the global division of labor, which is based on an unequal exchange of commodities and services between different parts of the globe. And this division of labor also predetermines, as I said, the methods of labor coercion in each functional part of the global economy. In the core, labor coercion, I don't know if you're familiar with the term labor coercion. Labor coercion refers to the imposition of wage work upon wider segments of the society. I mean, you have to force people to work. And how do you force people to work? Well, you use different methods. In the core, you manufacture consent, make people believe that they want to work, because work is admirable, and also it's the only way to survive. You do the same to some extent in the periphery, but when the going gets rough, you resort to more violent methods, such as coup d'etats and massive human rights abuses. So this is actually what determines the type of political regimes in each different functional part of the global world economy, which methods of labor coercion are being used. This is the main thing. Now, the academic sector, that is the knowledge industry, is of course not exempt from this systemic division of labor and its political implications. And the distribution of the political and economic risks that you see in different parts of the globe, in different academic environments currently, is in fact a reflection of that very spatial segregation of the methods of labor coercion. Following from there, that was actually the main argument behind our analysis. following from there, our main underlying argument has been in the book that political oppression in the periphery and economic precarization in the core are ultimately interrelated. There are the different faces of the same structural coin. That was actually what Esther also just said in her introduction. Political oppression in the periphery and economic precarization in the core actually represent methods of devaluation of intellectual labor force and making it politically weak. In the core, the main method is to make the intellectual labor force economically dependent on external funding and controlling the activities of research and teaching with market mechanisms. Whereas, in the peripheral countries, the main method is to directly ban critical ideas and punish dissidents because they can. But if you make the academic labor force economically vulnerable and reduce their negotiation capacity by eliminating job security, you also create a very timid and self-censoring labor force at the end of the day. But interestingly, in most cases, these two different methods can even proceed jointly, which was the case, for example, in many advanced democracies, how system-critical curricula or subaltern degree programs have been shut down based on lack of productivity arguments. That has been the case in Australia, in Hungary, in the US, in the UK, especially during the pandemic. The pandemic started, and before anyone could foresee what is going to happen, the universities laid off adjuncts, they shut down non-profitable degree programs, funding bodies, cut off their scholarships, etc. And most of the time we don't even understand why this is happening. We are still working, the students are still enrolled, why are you cutting budget? It was as if someone had been waiting to, cut off some degree programs, especially gender studies, for example. That was the case in Germany. Even during the times when I studied in the 2000s, that especially gender studies had been shut down in many universities because it was not profitable enough, which was actually ridiculous because many students wanted to go to gender studies, so it cannot be lack of productivity. It has to be something else. Anyway, these are leading scientific countries, right? With relatively high, in some cases even above OECD level of gross domestic expenditure on research and teaching. For example, Germany has a way higher percentage than the OECD average. Anyway, so the second shortcoming of the negative academic freedom approach stems from another thing. It stems from its tenure-centeredness. We have been talking about this just before we came to class. Of course, our understanding of tenure is different in different countries, but in most countries, academic freedom is still closely tied with tenure. This means this type of academic freedom that is in operation at the moment is reserved for those who have permanent jobs at the universities, who have a lifetime of job security. The problem is, however, that this type of academic career is vanishing. Most of the people that you see in your departments may be adjunct lecturers. Maybe not yet in Italy, but this is definitely the case in the US, in the UK, and in Germany, the most terrible academic labor market of all of them. So this type of academic career is not the reality for the majority of the academic workforce. I mean, we wish it were, but it's just not there anymore. And there is simply no tenure, especially in leading scientific countries of the world. Most of the faculty consists of temporarily employed, project-based postdoc researchers or adjunct lecturers. State funding for higher education has been decreasing steadily since the 1980s. And with that, tenure positions have been decreasing as well, and as a result, the majority of academic workers now consist of contingent faculty. Now, what are we doing when we continue to stick to a tenure-oriented concept of academic freedom? What are we doing? We are basically rooting for selective protection for the privileged few. It means we are only granting academic freedom to those who have tenure, and we are effectively depriving the majority of the PhD holders from academic freedom just because state officialdom is statistically unavailable for them. And I think at this point it's important to check and see how small that privileged group is in reality. How small the privileged group is that the tenure-centered academic freedom concept actually covers and protects. And this will also let us see how undemocratically academic freedom is being distributed in the so-called leading scientific countries and advanced democracies of the global north. Now, I would like to read some numbers here because they're very important. I usually hate numbers and I don't speak in statistics, but this is very telling. So please pay attention to the percentages because they tell a lot. Now, in the UK, I'm going to summarize the situation in leading scientific countries that either correspond to the OECD average or are slightly over the OECD average. In the UK, legal tenure has been abolished in 1988, but there was some opportunity to technically obtain permanent positions as teaching only or research only staff as contracts. However, over the last years, what they call atypical contracts, that is fixed-term contracts or zero-hour contracts. Can you imagine zero-hour contracts? What does it mean? Do you have an idea, students? Zero-hour contract. Do you know what it means to be employed on a zero-hour basis? It means if you are not called into work, you don't get paid. You are just, hireable and fireable on a whim. I mean, you don't even have a job actually, basically. You're not even fired, you're not hired. They call you in when they want someone to fill in, and otherwise you're just deprived of anything, including a salary, including an income. So you never know when and how much you can earn. And this has been the case with academic contracts in the UK. Now, according to the University and College Union's estimates, currently 44% of teaching-only staff and 68% of research-only staff are on fixed-term contracts. 3,545 academics in teaching are employed on 0 hours contracts. That means they're just being called in when there's a lecture to be given, and they get an business payment for that lecture, and otherwise they're unemployed. And 41% of teaching-only staff is employed on hourly paid contracts. And there have been, I don't know if you came across this, but there have been reports in the last few years, especially in The Guardian, where researchers had to resort to sex work or had to live in a tent because they couldn't afford to pay rent. In the US, the situation is not much better. The number of non-tenure staff with no contractual or legal job security has increased by 259% among full-time and 286% among part-time faculty between 1979 and 2011. And currently, 75.5% of college faculty are off the tenure track, and over 50% of them are part-time adjunct lecturers. In Germany, and this is my personal favorite, because it is the worst academic living remarkable, and it has absolutely nothing to do with my personal hate for Berlin. It is true, and it's a statistical fact, and there has been an ERC study on this in 2016 by Alexander Konzo. He categorized different academic labor markets in Europe. He came up with 4 different categories, like precarious but open in the sense of being open to people with foreign degrees and foreign citizenships. Precarious and open is UK. Precarious and closed, Germany, the only one. So it's both closed to people with foreign degrees and extremely precarious. Closed but secure was France and Italy. And then there was open and secure. I can't even remember what it was because I can't even imagine a country like this. Maybe Switzerland? I don't know. I guess Switzerland. Anyway, Germany is an independent academic environment for many reasons that we can talk also later, personally. In Germany, civil servant status and permanent positions exist only for full professors. Everything below full professor is fixed term, and full professors make up only 8% of the entire academic workforce, which means 92% of faculty are people who are working with fixed term contracts. And statistically, only 5% of the PhD holders have a prospect of tenure in London. And as a foreigner, of course, you can never even dream of it. In Denmark, civil servant status is being gradually eliminated. Austerity policies caused a continuous 2% annual decrease in basic funding. In the meantime, there has been a steady increase in the PhD supply, which, if you think about it, it's almost like a conspiracy. I mean, basic funding is decreasing at universities, which means the states are investing less in universities, especially in the basic functions of universities, like teaching and research. But in the meantime, we keep producing PhDs, more and more, every year. It's like we are actually raising the reserve army of disposable academic workers, willingly. That's why I always vehemently advise my students not to take the academic path, because you are going to be unemployed or underemployed. And you are going to also hate yourselves for that. But that's another story. Anyway, this combo of, decreasing public funding and increasing PhD supply has led to a significant rise in temporary researchers, temporary positions in Denmark, which are called external lecturers. What does it even mean, external lecturer? I mean, this is so exclusionary actually for faculty, like external lecturer, you don't even belong to the university. It's very degrading and very depressing. And their proportion, the proportion of external lecturers within the entire academic labor force, is currently estimated around 50 to 70%. In Italy, my favorite country, and it breaks my heart to say this, there used to be a 3-tiered structure that featured 2 professorial positions, full professor and associate professor, and 1 researcher position, and all of them used to be permanent. But the JM reform from 2010 has reduced the number of permanent positions by 25%, and it also introduced more complicated procedures for professoriates. Now, currently, more than half of the entire academic staff is on fixed-term contracts. I have here the numbers, like 68,400 people are on fixed-term, and only 47,500 people have permanent positions. So it's quite disproportional. And this new faculty majority, and this is a faculty majority, I mean, the majority of the academic workforce does not consist of tenured professors anymore. It's not a secure career path anymore. And this new faculty majority reportedly suffers from unpaid overwork, self-exploitation. There are actually wonderful studies done by Elisa Murgia, Barbara Kojo, and Paolo Rivetti. If you have the time, please Google and read. Very illuminating, very depressing, but very eye-opening. But I mean, we're not here to make people happy. We're here to tell the truth. So why am I externalizing the issue by saying this, non-tenured staff? I belong to them, even more so than anyone else. We suffer from unpaid overwork, self-exploitation, exclusion from social benefits, lack of infrastructural and institutional backing, exclusion from institutional decision-making mechanisms, because faculty boards consist only of tenured professors, and temporary faculty is not allowed to take part in faculty boards, which is ridiculous because they are the majority. I mean, I thought we were living in democratic countries here, but apparently the academic structures are not so democratically designed. And in many cases, the temporary faculty is also more prone to workplace misconduct and sexual harassment. There are terrible reports on sexual harassment in German academia, for example, where tenured professors basically have the same rights as feudal lords over serfs, which is true. I mean, I'm going to make a little parenthesis here. 2 years ago on this course, there was a scandal, and it should have been a scandal, and it would have been a scandal anywhere else, but in Germany, it's just, everyday life. In Erfurt, it turned out that a male professor has been offering grades to his female students in exchange for sex. He has been asking his students whether they would sleep with him and he would give them grades. I don't want to imagine what happened to the grades when the students said no, because it has to have a downside. I mean, if a guy comes up to you and says, if you sleep with me, I'm going to give you an A, it means if you don't sleep with me, I'm going to give you an F, right? Logically. So it came out, and it turned out that he was actually guilty. What do you think the University of Erfurt did? Make a guess.
Nothing.
I mean, basically yes, but I think it was more insulting than nothing. They cut his salary a little bit for a couple of months. Like 3 months, I guess, 3 or 6 months. He did not lose his tenure, he did not lose his position, he did not lose his state officialdom, and he's still teaching there. They did not even cut the salary completely, they cut it a little bit for a couple of months. And he's still there. And the name has been kept secret in all news reports. Why? Do we not deserve to know who this asshole is? No. Because this is Germany. Anyway, under these circumstances, I think it's pretty urgent that we ask two things. First of all, how much of academic freedom is left even in the countries that are seen as a bastion of it? And second, to what extent can the tenure-centered conception of academic freedom be feasible in the 21st century in the face of the changing composition of the academic workforce? If the majority of the academic workforce consists of non-tenured people, what is the use of a tenure-centered conception of academic freedom? Who are we protecting? And also, while we're at it, I think we should also question the uneasy relationship between tenure and academic freedom anyway. The idea of tenure, that is, giving university professors the status of civil servants, had developed in conjunction with the nation-states, with the nation-state-oriented modern research university after the German Humboldtian model. And accordingly, the tenured academic staff and their political and collective actions are legally restricted in many countries. This is, for example, the case in Germany. In Germany, tenured professors are not allowed to go on strike or organize collective action because as civil servants, they are believed, expected to represent the interests of the state. And what kind of a free critical thinking can be possible if you're expected to serve the interests of the state? This is an honest question, I'm really wondering. As you can see, when freedom is tied to state protection, when you understand freedom as protection, you are automatically putting yourself in an inferior, vulnerable position anyway. But if you do this, the most dangerous part is that you demand conformity in exchange for security. And this, this is actually not a surprise. This is the main logic of state as institution, right? State as institution confiscates a good portion of individual liberties and promises security to its citizens in exchange. And it operates with the same logic in its relationship to the universities. It grants protection and demands conformity. So, when I say that tenure is vanishing, please do not take it as if I'm lamenting some golden age of university, because there has never been a golden age of university. And this is something that we have to say right away. The university, as it was developed in the Germanic lands as part of the national unification movement, has actually always been a conservative, state-oriented institution. And the idea of academic freedom as patronage relationship between the state and intellectuals has been a deeply conservative idea as well. Now, the definition of tenure may be different in different parts of the global academic community, but basically, universities have always been tied to the state in some way or the other. Now, maybe we should recall the roots of the modern research university at this point, because it's useful to remember what the university has always been, in order to circumvent a false romanticization of the European university idea. Now, how did the modern research university emerge? Did you ever talk about it in any of your courses?
At the beginning of the course, they had some, but it's worth going to.
Well, in the 19th century, there were basically two models of university. The one was the French model, which separated research and teaching, and it ascribed the former research to independent academies, while teaching was being done in undergrad schools. And then there was the German model, which unified the two. It unified research and teaching, and this is what we have now. It set actually the prototype. And in the meantime, it established a strong tie between the state and the university. It assigned the duty to the university to create a national culture in the service of the state. That was the main function of the modern research university to create a national culture. Now, this type of institutionalization process, as we see in the German research university, was in the first place, of course, related to the unification and nationalization process of the German lands. And German idealists of the late 18th and early 19th century were preoccupied with the idea of transitioning from a state of nature to a state of reason. And in terms of the Hobbesian political philosophy, this transition amounted to the formation of a centralized state, right? You know, Hobbes describes the state of nature as a state of anarchy, where everyone is everyone's wolf, and there's no social contract, there's no social agreement, no political authority, no order whatsoever. Whereas the state of reason represents the situation where there's a social contract, which means people have assigned their freedom willingly to a higher authority. Now, I'm very happy that the 20th century historiography actually proved Hobbes to be an ignorant pig. But back in the 19th century, especially during the formation of nation states, and especially in regions like the current day Germany, where there was still no centralized government for most of the time of considerable power, and the region was still divided between feudal, post-feudal lands. These ideas still mattered at that moment, and the intellectuals were obsessed with the idea of sovereignty and centralized government. They saw it as their duty to contribute to the creation of it. So the German idealists thought about how to transition from a state of nature to a feudal structure with no centralized government to a state of reason, that is, a strong, authoritarian, centralized government with wider legitimacy. And their answer was through culture. And culture was to be created and transmitted to younger generations through education, for which the German word is Bildung, that also amounts to formation. It forms you. It creates people who have internalized the national culture. And in order to create a nation state, you first need to create a nation, right? You need a nation that corresponds to that state. And to create a nation, you need to create and spread a culture, a moral character that distinguishes a society from a loose tribe. And this moral character has to have an aesthetic aspect too, to appeal to people's libidinal energies in some way, and create sentiments of belonging and fear and awe, to create subservience and an emotional attachment to the state. So the university was the intermediary institution between nature's chaos and reason's order. It was supposed to reinterpret nature as a historical process, and it was supposed to reinterpret the human condition in such a way as to replace belief with reason and church with state. So that was the main task of the university as an institution. And there are of course details like Schleiermacher developed hermeneutics to describe this process whereby traditions are reinterpreted and given new meaning through reason. And in his thought, hermeneutics would start to create a nation that embodies an ethnicity with a moral character as a rational and unified polity, and the university was supposed to create that unity, to serve this mission. Now, what does this idea that actually underlies the modern research university say about the university as an institution? Does it sound like a revolutionary institution? No. It actually looks like a non-revolutionary, almost non-revolutionary, non-subversive, state-conform institution, right? It literally takes up the task to create a nation that would serve the state. And it had two duties: to produce the cultural, conceptual tools of rationalization and bureaucratization, and to form subservient, loyal generations that were necessary to maintain this process as the nation's subjects, to create political and social subjects. That was the main task of the university. And according to Alexander von Humboldt, who was the founding father of the German Research University, the ultimate objective of the university was to give the people an idea of nation-state to live up to, and the nation-state of people capable of living up to that idea. And this objective was to be achieved through culture. The university should produce and transmit culture, but a specific type of culture, of course. So you see how nationalistic and state-oriented the modern university has been since its beginning. So in a way, of course, it is true that the university and its mission has shifted over time. We have given new meaning to stuff, and also even the state-centeredness created its own critique out of our engagement with the society. And you know, in the 21st century, we are seeing yet another shift in the duty or in the main mission of the university, which is pretty much under the influence of commercialization and transnationalization and Bologna-style internationalization and so on and so forth. But this doesn't mean that what existed before was necessarily something much better. I mean, when we are criticizing what's going on right now in the universities, does not mean, oh, in previous eras it was so great and we were all so happy and now it's so shitty. No, it's a dialectical process. And we will always continue to criticize the conditions in which we live. And this is what we have to do. This is maybe the main mission of the university, despite its state-centeredness, that managed to preserve in some way, to some degree, to changing degrees in different parts of the world. Anyway, but the university as social institution, at least the modern research university, after the German model that became the prototype, has always had a strong link with the state. This we have to accept. Universities always had a strong link to the state as an institution, which also makes the idea of objective or impartial knowledge a bit problematic in many cases. And, you know, the disciplinary struggles as well as petty interpersonal struggles were also pretty much there in the 19th century, if you read some archival work on that. So there's nothing to romanticize about the university in the past. But the main difference between the past and the present is maybe that back in the 20th and 19th centuries, the supply of qualified academic workforce used to be much smaller, because not many people could afford to have a college degree. Even less people could afford to take on a career path that was characterized by low salaries. I mean, it was a secure path back in the 19th and 20th centuries, or for most of the 20th century at least, for 3/4 of the 20th century, it was a secure path, but it was always characterized by low salaries, which functioned in a way as a selective mechanism for a long time. And for a long time, only white dudes from well-off families could afford to have a college degree or could afford to take up an academic career. Only people who did not necessarily have to earn money or who did not necessarily have to depend on one salary could afford to choose academia as a career path, right? And this also set a lot about the classicist nature of academic career for most of the 20th century. Now it has changed, but interestingly, it's not a secure career path anymore. You know, there's this saying that I heard from a historian friend, and it's hilarious, but it's also sad. The moment something becomes available to the proletarians, the moment it also gets devaluated and, you know, has less value in the market. The same happened with academic career, actually. You know, it opened to kids from proletarian families, but it ceased to be a secure and prestigious career path. Now we are just, you know, bordering on homelessness in academia. So, but anyway, coming back to the relationship between the state and universities, this is a problematic relationship in any case, and this is one of the reasons why in our book we question the limits of the predominant approach to academic freedom. We argue that tenure should not be the only center of academic freedom. We are not talking about abolishing tenure, but we argue that the threats against academic freedom involve subtler and more varied mechanisms than the obvious political ones, and we argue that if your freedom comes in the form of state protection, it's only a matter of, you know, time that that same state can come and bite you in the back eventually. So we argue that the type of state protection in the form of tenure, despite all its shortcomings, is not even attainable for the majority of the academic workforce anymore in this day and age, and we urgently plead for a more inclusive definition of academic freedom that expands its power to non-tenured faculty as well. And the contributions in the book draw on academic employment conditions, on the commodification of and eventual discarding as well of subaltern disciplines as marketing props, and they draw on the conditions of migrant students and scholars in the US, in the UK, and Europe as political pawns. And in the light of these cases that we talk about in the book, we felt like we needed to go beyond the mere absence of censorship, and we needed to explore various socioeconomic dynamics that determine researchers' actual capabilities as knowledge workers. We define academics as knowledge workers. This is also one of the main issues that I'm going to come back to in a bit. But the mechanisms that we are facing at the moment, apart from overt political oppression, which is very visible for understandable reasons, those dynamics include the market-oriented restructuration of higher education, instrumentalization of knowledge, marginalization of non-profitable degree programs and research plans, and intersectional inequalities in academia that create very different career chances for people coming from very different backgrounds. And as an alternative to the current discourse, we propose to expand our understanding of academic freedom in two ways, basically. First of all, qualitatively, in the sense of not reducing academic freedoms to formal rights, but to add practical capabilities to it. And second, we propose to expand the conception of academic freedom quantitatively, in a sense that academic freedom should be expanded to cover non-tenured majority as well. And to do this, I think two revisions are necessary. One of the revisions that I propose is actually, and it pertains to the definition of academic, and the other one pertains to the definition of freedom. First of all, I think we need to stop thinking of ourselves as exceptional. I mean, academics should not be seen as an exceptional group among the working class. We are wage laborers. Some of us are even below wage laborers, most of us. And the fact that you love what you do does not mean that what you're doing is also work. I mean, when you talk talk to academics, we do unpaid labor all the time. I mean, the entire academic industry is based on unpaid labor, actually. You do unpaid reviews, you give unpaid lectures, you go to conferences, and you even struggle to get travel and accommodation expenses back. And the work that you do is completely unpaid. And whenever you confront a fellow academic about this problem, it's like, but I love teaching, but I love it. I mean, do you really love it, or do you not have any other chance, first of all? If you're non-tenured, you're mostly kind of compelled to do these things because you have close to zero leverage to negotiate with people. You treat everything as an opportunity. You don't want to mess up your career chances. You just suck it up and do what you need to do. And also, I mean, you are literally preaching workers' rights in classroom. And you're not even able to defend your own workers' rights. You're not even able to demand a recompensation of your own labor. This is not loving what you do. This is actually hostile to what you're doing. You are harming academic work. You are contributing to the devaluation of it. You are making it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and more disposable than ever. You are just an idiot. You do not know what you do. You're just a clueless idiot. Or a hypocrite who loves talking about revolution and workers' rights in the classroom, but, you know, looks away when incredibly terrible things happen in your own ranks. And most of the time, this complicity of the academic workforce stems from our illusions of exceptionality, because we do not consider ourselves as workers. We think that we are doing something else. We are workers. Most of us are not even workers anymore. We are unemployed. It's even more miserable than that. It's ridiculous. So, this is one of the facts that we need to establish. You are a wage laborer and you need to demand your workers' rights. And the second proposition that we may make to expand the idea of academic freedom is we should reformulate academic freedom as capabilities. Here we follow Amartya Sen's positive and subject-oriented approach to freedom. We talk about freedom as a set of actual capabilities and opportunities to realize formal freedoms. We see freedom as a social thing, not as a formal, legal, on-paper thing, but something that can only be realized in a social context as a capability. And we see the absence of authoritarian intervention into research and teaching as a prerequisite, as a necessary but not sufficient condition. But what is more crucial here is the power and opportunity to give content to that freedom, to make people capable of making use of those freedoms that are on paper. And we think, or actually we witness that people who are dependent on external funding, like myself, and are doing, project-based, precarious work, wandering from one institution to the other, just drifting along, working on research agendas that are being dictated on them either by market incentives or by their seniors' interests, so on and so forth. Those people cannot be in the position to do research and teaching freely. Those people cannot really make use of their freedoms in the sense of capabilities. They are not capable to use the freedoms that are existent on paper. They may possess formal academic freedoms. In some cases they don't even, because academic freedoms do not cover non-tenured faculty in most contexts. But even if they do, those freedoms cannot be effectively translated into actual capabilities in the current academic climate, because there can be no theoretical freedom detached from the inequalities and hierarchies. As I said, freedom is always only realizable in a social condition. It can be realized only collectively and as a derivative of a set of concrete socioeconomic possibilities. And that's why we think it's time to redefine both academic and freedom. So that was actually what I wanted to hammer into your hands.
Thanks so much.